Today on Catholic in America, another show about what did Pope Francis just say? Welcome back to Catholic in America, and if you're probably been living under a rock or hasn't been, or you've been out of the country like Father Tom, maybe you haven't heard the comments that Pope Francis has made recently. It was about a couple of weeks ago when he was in Singapore. It's been widely distributed, and so there's lots of people who know about this. So what actually did he say? Father Michael?
Well, I heard this, I was basically just reported and coming across all the reports as Pope Francis says all religions are the same and you don't have to, you can be Christian or Muslim or Sikh or Buddhist or Hindu. And it's all good, man. That's basically more or less like the way has been reported, which obviously a lot of people have responded with very strong, I know maybe some people have been very strong positive, things towards that, but a lot of people within the Catholic Church, a lot of very negative takes on it. So by the time you just missed it completely.
Technically, I mean, I was in the Keys, so I don't know if that's really out of the country, but yeah,
I don't know if it's a part of the country
blessedly missed this one.
You did.
But yeah, so apparently, yes, all religions are equally valid. Is that what the rumor is?
That's what I think. It's what people are trying to say.
Yeah,
and so,
which obviously would be different than what the Church believes on that.
Correct.
What the Bible seems to indicate on that. I heard a local Baptist pastor recently. Someone told me that their family member had gone to the local Baptist church was railing against, unlike Pope Francis, who thinks everything, we only believe Jesus leads to heaven. So anyway, I'm glad he's talking about Pope Francis.
And he is.
He didn't ask me for clarification. This is not the Baptist pastor we've had on the show, by the way. This is a different Baptist pastor. So anyway, so just it's making the rounds. It's out there in the zeitgeist, and some people are taking this as evidence of why. Of the heretical nature of Pope Francis. Some people are taking it as evidence of why the Catholic Church doesn't have a clear teaching authority or the Pope isn't infallible. Some people
don't even understand salvation.
Right, so there's definitely people who are using this to reinforce their understandings of Pope Francis, of the Church, of salvation, of Christianity. They're taking a lot from one throwaway line. So we're I hope to get into it today, but it's obviously controversial and worth discussing.
I mean, off of one off-the-cuff statement that was made to a bunch of children in Singapore. We've got a lot of controversy.
Yeah, but I think it's also to put this all into context. It was an off-the-cuff statement.
It was.
That he spoke ad hoc, sort of not dissimilar from sometimes how former President Donald Trump goes sometimes off script. Keep the script, and then just starts talking. And so sometimes there can be some strange parallels between sometimes the two who go back and forth speaking off the cuff and causing a lot of problems.
So I've got this kind of this theory going on right now that Pope Francis and Donald Trump are mere opposites in parallel universes that kind of like orbit each other. I don't think either one would appreciate me saying that.
No, I don't think so.
And I don't think anyone's going to appreciate me saying that about the Holy Roman Pontiff that I owe allegiance and respect to, and which I give and love the Pope and pray for him daily. But anyway, there's something in there. I'm going to keep working on this theory, and so
we're making a whole show about that.
This is like a Legend of Zelda. This is the dark self.
Absolutely, this is the shadow world, the upside down kind of thing. So
I can see that.
Stranger Things reference.
So the question is what did he actually say? So
Father Doug, I'm glad you asked. So again, as Father Tom said, this was actually in a meeting with young people in an interreligious meeting in Singapore. So he's basically he's gone through. It's an apostolic journey where he went to Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Timor Leste, and Singapore. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever traveled to the East before or traveled to Asia, as to the Orient as it used to be called. And and then had to have a coherent conversation with anybody. It's very difficult. So he is in his late 80s, and he's made this trip, and an apostolic trip, to basically, share the gospel with people, to celebrate liturgies, some areas where Catholics and Christians are a real severe minority. Right. And it's against that backdrop. So again, all this, as far as any impromptu statements he might say, I think do need to be weighed against that as well. So he, in this address, he's basically responding that several people have spoken during this interreligious kind of meeting of people from different religious backgrounds, not just Catholics and Protestants, but all sorts of religions. And he says, now I'll speak spontaneously. And then he talks about the courageousness of young people seeking the truth. And he encouraged young people not just be sort of armchair critics. And he later goes into technology as well. Technology is a good thing for connecting, but can become a trap that we get stuck in. Yeah. Really goes hard on that as well. But then he's talking about how young people have the ability to maybe bridge some of those gaps of discomfort that we have that keep us from doing the hard work of interreligious dialogue. Now, people can have different opinions about interreligious dialogue, whether it works, whether it helps, but in a place of the world where Christians are an often persecuted minority, interreligious dialogue is not just a comfortable academic event like it might be at like a
Berkeley or Oxford,
Berkeley or something like that. Sure. Here in the United States, there it can have life or death ramifications. Right. And so the policies that are being put in place, the discussions that are happening, people seeing that people who are from a different religion actually are human and are important and are good and worthy of respect. It's important. And again, you might kind of just sort of downplay the whole thing and think that it's just liberal nonsense to talk with people of different religions. But Pope Francis obviously doesn't think so. St. Paul obviously didn't think so either. In his dialogue with the where he's with the in Athens, where he's talking about, like, I see you Athenians are really religious people. You got a lot of gods here. I want to tell you about this one God who's unknown, who you guys don't yet know. And everything in your poets and your philosophers and religions is pointing ultimately towards him. So within that context, he says this, and this is where it gets kind of unclear theologically.
But also in deference to the Holy Father, who is a Jesuit, I think it's also important understanding the Jesuit mentality on things like that. And the Jesuits were founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola in the 1600s, right? So, and they were founded specifically to combat...
Or 16th century.
16th century. So to combat the problems with the Protestant philosophy and Protestant theology, right? As well as, so it was again, in response to the Protestant Reformation, as well as to the finding of the New World, and specifically of the finding of new pathways into Asia. That's why the Jesuits were some of the first Christians to go from Europe to the Orient, to Asia, to China, to Japan.
And got in trouble with all that, too.
You got Matteo Ricci, you got...
Lorenzo Nobili, who's in India, phenomenal.
So obviously you have Francis Xavier, you have the various different Jesuits who went over there. And the first thing that the Jesuits do when they go specifically to those areas of the world which are predominantly not Christian and oftentimes not heard is that they enculturate. They go into, they for a period of years before they even try preaching, they try to get to know the cultures and get to know the people before they start trying to explain the gospel and trying to do that, which is very different model than like the Franciscans and the Dominicans classically used in the New World when they came to America. So like the Jesuits, kind of their whole philosophy from their beginning has always been a respect for other cultures and finding common ground. Right. So let me respect your culture. Let's find common ground. Let me show you where we are in agreement on various different things. And so let's focus on those positive areas of agreement of where we actually have this. And that's why actually, specifically speaking in Japan, the Jesuits were very, very successful in Japan because there was a respect for the culture and respect for the religious and spiritual traditions of the people, which was initially speaking, was seen as, okay, well, these people are respectful, and therefore there was a lot of success. So like that's the origin point of recognizing like the Jesuit philosophy is not coming in and telling people where they're wrong. But the first point of Jesuit missionary activity is to focus on, okay, where are you right? Right? And then let's find common ground, and then let's talk about some of these nuances of things like that. So I think that's important to recognize, like when the Jesuit mentality and spirituality and missionary activity is going to these places, it's about focusing first upon where you're right, before I'm going to try to criticize or to be, and that's actually even in Pope Francis's dialogue that he was talking about with those is he talks about constructive criticism. Like if I'm going to be constructive, like not being deconstructive criticism. But anyways.
No, I think it's important because two things can be held in tension, because I think something like we'll get into what Pope Francis actually said that set people off, but that people saying, you have people like, well, I thought you were supposed to preach Jesus to these people, which is true, and other people being like this whole aspect of you have to learn how to speak in a language that other people can understand. I can just stand up and say like Jesus, 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 but if people don't speak English, it doesn't really matter, or don't have no context for who Jesus is. And so if they just kind of, which happen a lot of times, it's an inherently messy way of doing evangelization and of doing mission work and everything else. And Pope Francis and most Jesuits that I know are kind of okay with that. Now, there can be maybe even nefarious aspects. I'm sure there are Jesuits who don't believe in preaching the gospel, don't actually believe in and they would call that a heretical stance. If someone didn't believe in the
Jesuits who'd like to change the teachings of the church.
I'm sure there might be some of those out there. It's possible. I'm not naming any names at all. I don't know the heart and mind, but I know some very, very good Jesuits who are holy men and on fire evangelists and know Jesus and share Jesus with their whole lives. And Pope Francis this is what he said he wants to do, and that's why he goes on these apostolic trips as well. He doesn't do this just to like have nice conversations, ultimately to preach Jesus, and he's going to do it from his own background and his own way of doing things. Again, it might not be the way that someone else likes, but I can also say too, all right, if you want to set up a mission trip to Singapore, go preach the gospel. You should do that as well. So anyway, as he kind of challenges young people to go out of their comfort zones. Do not get lost in this media trap that so many young people, so many not so young people. All of us have to look at this as well for ourselves. I hold my phone in my hand here. Right. People should stop looking at their phones so much. It's so true. But then he talks about kind of this, and he uses this image, and I think to me it's not a great image, but again, it's an analogy. He says. This is very important because if you start arguing, talking about interfaith dialogue, my religion is more important than yours, or mine is the true one, yours is not true. Where does this lead? Somebody answer. A young person answers destruction. And that is correct, says Pope Francis. All religions are paths to God. That's kind of the line that's been sort of taken out of the context and said, okay, I will use an analogy. They're like different languages that express the divine, but God is for everyone, and therefore we are all God's children. So we can pause there and keep going with it. But I would like to kind of, because I think we can legitimately say, is this the best analogy to use or is it not? If this is taken to its logical conclusion, is that consistent with Christian orthodoxy or not? All those are worthwhile things. Yeah. But I think hopefully we're at least hearing that he's not saying this is like, I will now change the church's teaching from the See of Peter about what we believe about it. He's obviously not saying that. So. But I don't know if you all have any thoughts kind of up to that point.
I mean, because you're right, it is an analogy. I mean, it is. He is trying to make he is trying to relate to these children and to the context in which he finds himself. And so, I mean, you can understand kind of what he's trying to say as far as trying to give them an understanding, especially with the context that you've given for Jesuits, that he's trying to find that commonality here. That we're all. I mean. I can say the things I wish he would have said or the things that I hope he meant, that we are all on a path to God. And we do need to find that way to God, but we're all trying to find the true God. And at some point, that would have to come into play. I mean, that have to come into the conversation. But I guess maybe he thinks at this point he's at a point of entry with them. I'm not for sure how many times he's ever been to the Orient, how many times he's ever been to Singapore. So maybe he's seeing that as an opportunity to kind of try and come in and not be judgmental, I guess. I'm guessing that's what it would be.
I mean, I think that if you're going to break it apart, remember he's speaking colloquially. And he's speaking to a large group of people, and he's trying to make.
He's even saying he's speaking colloquially as he's speaking colloquially.
Right. But the point is, he says, and I mean, it depends on what how you would understand what he's trying to say. Are you understanding it? I'd say in the spirit in which he probably meant it, because I don't think that he is a pluralist, and I'll explain that in a second. But the point being is, what is he saying? I mean, I don't think it's irrational for a person to say that all people have a religious sense. right? Unless you try to suppress or kill that religious sense. Like, so people just have a natural, all human beings are fundamentally born with a religious sense because we have a yearning for the divine, right? And so regardless of the world religion, right, that all persons and all religions are yearning for the divine. Now, how closely that religion is going to bring you to the actual divine, right? But there still is the religious sense, and therefore you have the world religions, which all world religions to a certain extent are exploring religious themes, which is immortality, death, like what happens after death, like what the human spirit, like immortality, like all those different things. And so all those things, the very fact that we're like the human spirit, regardless of whether it's conscious of God or not conscious and looks to God in paganism or whatever, like there still is this religious sense which is inherently that God built into our nature. And so in that sense, like I think that if you were to look at that and like all religions are pathways to the divine, if you look at it in that sense, but even Justin Martyr, like St. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus in the early church, 1st and 2nd centuries, talks about the virtuous pagan, right? Talks about the virtuous pagan, the pagan who seeks virtue and who sought virtue, and despite the fact that they worshipped false gods and things like that, but they sought truth. And insofar, and this is Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, like multiple ones, talk about that, and insofar as they were pursuing truth, despite the fact that they found themselves in a religion which didn't have the fullness of truth, they still pursued the truth, and in that sense, they were pursuing God. And so like there's a lot of early church documents which talk about the virtuous pagan, and like even that they talked about that like people like Aristotle, Plato were proto-Christians. Like, and so in that sense, I think that if you understand Francis's words in that context of like recognizing like the religious sentimentality of human beings, which would be actually kind of in opposition to like the atheists, like, no, we have no spiritual sense or religious. No, it seems pretty common that despite all where you were born and like what religion you were raised in, like there is to about 98% of the population believes that there's a religious sense, and that sense that directs us to God. And obviously, like in the Far East, and especially in the Orient, like you're going to find lots of different religions which are going to promote pluralism, that all paths towards God, right, which would be like parts of Hinduism and Buddhism, or all religions are just equal paths toward God. And that's not what that's not what Francis is saying. That's not Jesuit mentality. It's not that all are equal paths.
And that's not what the church teaches
and that's not,
either. I think it's very important.
All paths can be or are directed ultimately towards the search for God, but Francis did not say that all religions are equal.
Right. But which is the analogy he gives, though, is about languages, and that we all, it's like languages. And so that's what I think you were trying to say, Father Michael, is it gives an appearance of that, though, if you're not, depending on the way you're reading it, if you don't have this context, it sounds like he's saying, all paths are just like languages. We all have languages. We're all trying to communicate. They're all just as equally valid. So all these paths are as equally valid as well.
That's the point. Is like equally valid, and that's where people, I think, are rightfully is Francis trying to promote this pluralist philosophy. Right. And for those who are watching, I mean, pluralism is very simply is that all religions are equally the same, and that there's lots of different religions. All of them are equally the same. There's no distinction between them. They're all just different. One thing with pluralism is the analogy of like there's an elephant, and everyone's touching the same elephant, right? But one is holding the trunk, one is holding the feet, one is holding the tail, and they're all describing the elephant.
They're all blind.
They're all blind. They're all blind. They're all describing the elephant in different ways, but it's the same thing, right? And it's all everyone has a little fragmented pieces, a fragment piece of the same thing.
Well, and it's very popular today too. I mean, I'm sure we have viewers that may have even said this themselves. That to each his own, kind of to a certain extent. Your way to God. I mean, who am I to say it's wrong for you to see it that way? Who am I to say that you're not understanding God, or that's not your path to God, and this is my path to God? And so, you can see why it causes a.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want us to jump into as well, like what we believe, the difference in Christianity as far as the incarnation and God becoming man, actually revealing Himself to us, as limited as we are in our appreciation of that. Right. But also, I think that there's something to this, because someone has brought this up, and I think it's very interesting and an important distinction, that we believe that our faith is so true that it's worth dying for. Because even like the people that you mentioned, Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon, like this early church, Justin Martyr, that they were saying, okay, I can see the truth and the beauty and the goodness, as limited as it might be, and even in pagan religions and pagan philosophies. However, that this reality of Jesus is so true that I will die for it, right? Because it's not just like, it doesn't matter. You can be an atheist, you can be a worship Zeus, or you can be this. It's just sort of, so there's something within that. I think that some people maybe have taken that as a slight to those people who have suffered and died for the faith, to say like, well, all religions are actually, again, are all just different languages, languages trying to describe the same thing, or they're all the search for God. Because he does actually say, which is just very interesting to me, he goes on to say, all religions are paths to God. I will use an analogy, different languages that express the divine, but God is for everyone, and therefore we are all God's children. But my God is more important than yours. Is this true? This is what he says. He says, it's kind of interesting. There's only one God, and religions are like languages, paths to reach God. Some Sikh, some Muslim, some Hindu, some Christian. Understand? Again, he's obviously having a conversation with young people here.
Right.
So interfaith dialogue among young people takes courage. And then he goes on to talk about that courage. So what's interesting to me, because he's kind of betraying his own Christian understanding. So there's only one God, but like Hindus don't believe that. They believe there's many gods. So they're kind of like, we know you guys got all the different things. You got the Shivas, you got the Vishnus, you got the different stuff. We know there's only one God for real. So
which is what St. Paul says in Corinthians.
Right, exactly.
He's like, there's only one God, all these other gods, if there are even gods out there, which he's kind of a reference to, well, there might be demons.
Right.
But he's like, but there's only one God.
Yes. Right. Yes. So, and in a sense too, there's like a certain ease that St. Paul has, because obviously St. Paul's coming from this against a very pagan backdrop where there's tons of gods, and there's Jewish believers that have now become Christians against this backdrop in this context, much more similar to Singapore probably than it is to our context here in the United States of America. Where they're worrying because like, well, this meat's been offered to these different gods. Are we allowed to eat it, or does that? And he's saying it doesn't really matter. Those gods are nothing. And
they don't exist.
They don't exist.
Okay.
So that's St. Paul. And I think he should have a conversation with some personalities, some Catholic personalities, and their teachings about demons and gods and other things too. But anyway, they should dialogue more with St. Paul. But anyway, but he does that because he's like, because there's only one God. And so in a sense, these things aren't true. And he works for the conversion of those people who have in paganism. But he doesn't seem to be as threatened by it that I think we kind of see. Because I feel like the response has been, and I would love to see what the response is. Is there a response in the Catholic channels throughout Asia? Are people in a very different cultural context? Because for us, I feel like it's kind of like people in America, United States, maybe more Catholics and Christians who are trying to find stability, trying to find I need a clear statement from the Pope that says like we're right and the rest of the world is wrong. Right. There's really hope in the Pope to say that, and Pope Francis just doesn't talk that way.
Not very often.
Not very often. Yeah. So. It's frustrating because he's not, in a sense, the Pope's not poping the way we want him to pope. You know that.
That's it.
And it's like, but the church is bigger than just the Pope, and the church has clear teachings on these areas, and the way that we preach and teach those in a variety of different circumstances is going to be it's done in different ways.
You have that, and then you also have the crowd in the United States that are waiting to hop on anything that the Pope says to prove that he's, whatever they want to prove about him. He's not the Pope, or he's not the real Pope, or he's a bad Pope, or he's a radical Pope.
Infallibility isn't a real thing.
Infallibility isn't real. Whatever it may be, you have those people who are willing to hop on that as well. And it seems like, in at least in the United States, those are the people who have the loudest voices. Those are the people who have the podcasts and the blogs and all those sorts of things. And so when this kind of thing gets reported, it's almost always reported in a negative way. And for those people who are waiting for that, and for those people who have accepted that, it's been done so many times and so often that they're to the point of thinking these things about the Pope. Then to hear something like this, it's just one more, it's just one more piece of evidence that this guy isn't who he says he is, or he's not the one we need, or we shouldn't have elected him. All those sorts of things.
Yeah, but let me, if I can.
And I'm not saying there's not. Look, I'm not saying that he hasn't said anything that lends itself to people having criticism of him. Of course he has. I mean, any leader has. But again, this just feeds into that frenzy, and I think for us as Catholic priests, if I could sit down with Pope Francis and talk to him for a second, I'd be like, please stop saying things like this. Just please be more clear. Be who you really are.
I get it, and I obviously I like to have a little more clarity and precision in language, but that's not what he means. Francis.
It's not.
Francis is not. I mean, he's clear in his writings. That's why I say anyone who actually wants to know what Francis actually thinks, look at his official writings of what he has actually written.
Because everything
and promoted as official teaching, as opposed to what he says on a plane or what he says to a group of people, whether it be to his comments to the Italians saying certain things, or to this. But I mean, I want to also bring in another cultural example, historical example from culture. And this is also something like from a Jesuit perspective is important. Like of recognizing, like going back to the history of the Jesuits, right? And go back to the Jesuits when they went to Asia the first time, right? Which is where Francis is now, like China, like Japan, all these different places. Like when reports started coming back to Europe, right, of all the missionary activity that the Jesuits were doing and all these different conversions, you had the hardliners in Europe who started
Dominicans.
The Dominicans. It was.
Yes.
No. We did studies on this in the seminary. So you had the hardliners, the Dominicans, back in Europe, who everything that was coming back. There was also a power struggle between the Dominicans and the Jesuits at that time in the universities.
We don't have that in the church.
No, absolutely.
Come on.
Never.
Yeah.
So, but the point being is, like, you had the hardliners who always were accusing the Jesuits of two things, that they were syncretists, right? And so if you don't know that, look up syncretism, which is trying to make compatible that which is not compatible.
Right.
So they were always accusing them of syncretism, and they were accusing them of pluralism. Like those were the two major things the Dominicans were always accusing the Jesuits. And an example of that, of these things of, okay, you're trying to make sync whether it is out of sync. Because like when the Jesuits were in Japan, they looked at the culture, they enculturated, they learned Japanese, they started to understand the traditions of people, and they're like, oh, okay, you worship your ancestors, right? So ancestral worship and the ancestral thing with your families, and that's why family and ancestral worship, and the whole understand this, like they're like we have something very similar. It's called the communion of saints.
Right.
And so because they understood their religious spiritual practices of ancestral worship, they were able to found common ground of saying, this is very similar to actually what we believe, and this is what we believe. We believe in the communion of saints. We believe that they're in heaven. They believe that they're with God. When reports got back to Europe, they're like, oh, this is syncretism. You're trying to do that as opposed to finding common ground, right? Right. And so I think that in the same spirit, like Francis knows the history of the Jesuits. He understands this history, but at the end of the day, he's not going to allow, to a certain extent, the minutia of getting involved in the heavy theology. That's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to evangelize.
Right.
And so that's what I'm saying. There has to be, in my opinion, when we're hearing, especially Francis, who's out there actually evangelizing. We have to interpret him. The first thing, as Christians, we're called to interpret everything, whether it be the Pope or whether it be each other, through the lens first of charity,
right,
as opposed to through the lens of suspicion and cynicism,
right,
and as opposed to accusing the Holy Father of being a syncretist or a pluralist, like
or a heretic
listen to it in the spirit in which it's actually meant. And maybe it's unclear. He's obviously very unclear.
Sure.
Right, but he's not speaking as Pope Benedict used to speak, who was a very clear German theologian who was always precise.
And people still misunderstood Pope Benedict.
They did him too.
And they still took him out of context, and they still used words against him. He still said certain things that you're like, ooh, that could be used. In a sense, you might be addressing a certain issue, but then it can be used as a weapon against some other aspect of church teaching on some other edge with it. Because it is interesting. So he's now completed this Asia trip, and he just went to Luxembourg. He just went to another part of Europe. And there's the same sort of things coming up within that, where people now are slamming him because he was basically talking about the complementarity of men and women, talking about against basically like an over masculinization of men, like feminism used as so he's getting so in a sense like trying to he's going to say lots of things, and you got to hold the whole thing in concert and against what the church teaches on these things. And he actually it's really fascinating because he spoke against abortion. It's a very pro-abortion country, and they came after him for it. And he came back with his what he says about abortion, about it's like hiring a hitman. He said that abortion is murder. He says it very, very clearly. But again, that's not going to get any play because that's just him reiterating what the church teaches on this sorts of stuff. So if there's some sort of thing that can be used either as an attack or as a watering down. Because this is important too. And this may be the thing that Pope Francis or the Vatican press office, because there are people, we're doing the work of the Vatican press office here by actually having this conversation.
We are.
And
we are.
We don't get any money.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? The money actually funds that, so I don't know what it's used for. But for the Vatican press office. But in a sense that like, that none of this happens in a vacuum. He says it to a group of students in Indonesia. We hear about it instantaneously across the world.
I mean, it was quick.
And in a sense to say that this could easily be misunderstood, or this could be used somewhere on the culture war, or this could be used in people who are within the church who do try to be syncretist or do try to be, like you say, pluralist, or you know, basically say that all religion is the same and Jesus is just one revelation of God, just like the Buddha, all this sort of nonsensical stuff that it is not Christianity. So in a sense, like, I think sometimes stuff can be said, and then from the Vatican, they almost seem surprised that like, oh, people would take this the wrong way. And it's like, yeah, of course, because there are fights going on in the world right now. So it is important for clarity. Now, it's not I don't think it's Pope Francis's job every time he ever says something to hit every nuance around all the edges and all the angles.
He never quit speaking.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. And so anyway, so I don't think that's his gift.
Yeah.
I don't think that I'll bet you though, for those kids that were there, for the people that he's actually speaking to, because this the people that I know have been in those sort of situations with Pope Francis, it was a life-changing event.
Right.
And maybe for those kids who have no concept of Christianity, maybe grew up prejudiced or even hateful of Christians, they had this, oh, this guy kind of represents Christianity. This is the Pope, you know, and he's come to speak to us like that. That's going to leave a lasting impact in their lives. Yeah. And so to me, Pope Francis doesn't seem to really care what we think about it. Right. The world's away, right. And whether it's used in a culture war. Now you can say that's irresponsible. You can say that's, you know, he could have been more clear. All those things, and
especially when we represent 6% of the population of Catholics in the world, something like that, 6 or 7%. Isn't that what the United States represents? 6 to 7% of the population of the world.
I mean,
something like that. You know, there is to a certain extent, even though we're very loud, we seem like we're 50% or more. We are, again, we're across the pond, if you will, and we're in a different part of the world, different culture from him. I mean, all those kinds of things.
Now, let me put this before you guys.
It's harder for him to say that.
So if you guys were at a parish and you had, let's say, an associate pastor, and your associate pastor was asked to give a little address at an interreligious thing in your local mosque or Baha'i temple, and he said this exact same thing, would you have a conversation? Because you got some authority for this person. Would you have a conversation with him that he probably shouldn't have said it that way?
I'd bring it up with him.
Okay.
I'd bring it up and I'd ask him for clarity of what he meant and what he intended.
Yeah.
Because recognizing, okay, well, he could mean this. On the other hand, he could mean this. And so, like, I'd ask him what he meant, and just be aware of how people are going to hear that.
Off to people.
It's not what you say. Sometimes it's how you say it, and sometimes it's not how you say it. It's what you're saying. So, like, the question is that. So, I'd bring it up, but I wouldn't report him to the bishop.
But you wouldn't be on the sidelines being like, just how I would have said it.
Right.
No.
Okay. That's right.
Yeah. Again, and I think this is important for us to say that, and it's for Catholics or non-Catholics to hear this, that the Pope, and maybe we can get into this, he's not changing church teaching here.
Yeah, that's where we're going next.
Yeah, and that, we actually teach? There are ways to actually dogmatically define and discuss these sort of things. It's not through this. And it's okay to be not okay with the way that this was expressed. However, we still have to have respect, love, obedience to the Pope because of the office that he occupies, because he's a successor to St. Peter. So anyway, so all those things can be true.
Hold on, but also the other thing is this, like most people who I understand are upset about this are concerned with dogmas and doctrines and infallibility. I would encourage people to actually understand and to look into what infallibility actually is, because not everything that comes out of Pope Francis's mouth, the Pope's mouth, not everything he does is infallible.
Especially when when you're saying this is spontaneous.
Yeah, I mean, so the only things that are infallible are things that are through ordinary or extraordinary magisterium, and there's a clear understanding of what that is. So for people who are trying to use this, well, he's not infallible and things like that. Well, it's very clear you don't understand infallibility.
Right.
Right. Infallibility is not that everything that Pope Francis says. He's not perfect.
Right.
Right. But it's just that if he uses the ordinary or extraordinary form, a formula, like, and that's the thing. The ordinary formula being a church council, extraordinary being a statement from the chair of Peter. Outside of that, like, Francis can make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and so whether this is a mistake or whether it's not, it's not even a question of infallibility.
So I would say, and maybe this is the way, because if the Pope speaks, I don't have to who cares? And that's not infallible. Like, in a sense, I think that's
some people that's
the needle we have to thread with this. It's not just a matter of like, is he speaking infallibly right now, or is he not? Because when the Pope speaks, if he gets up and gives a homily, I could be like, well, that's not an infallible statement. No, that's the Bishop of Rome, who's the universal lawgiver and the supreme pontiff.
Authority.
I need to give that religious assent and obedience. Now, would I say that is this an infallible statement? That's where we get into like, not necessarily, because it's always going to be in conjunction with. So it's not like an either or. It's either when is he speaking infallibly, then I have to listen to him. When is he not? So
definitive, non-definitive. I'm at all.
Which he actually recently said a couple months ago. He put out something on people who are basically nitpicking him on that, saying that not everything that I'm going to say is infallible. You still need to listen.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so I would say that too. That even things that the Pope is not saying infallibly that challenge me personally. I won't get into what those things might be right now. Like, I still need to listen to them. I still have religious adherence to them. I have to have respect and obedience to him, just like I would for my bishop. If my bishop is saying something like, hey, I think you need to do this, I'm like, well, did he say that under holy obedience? Because that's the only time I have to listen to my bishop. They're like, no, he's my bishop. So there's something within that I think we had this sort of either or, but it goes back to, and this is a huge thing, whole other show, there's an old word for ultramontanism, which is basically like we just look over the mountains towards Rome, everything, whatever the Pope says goes. We just think about the Pope.
Right.
Like, in a sense, what the Pope says in Singapore, I hope it's good, but it doesn't really affect my ministry, doesn't affect my parish, doesn't affect my people, it doesn't affect me.
No, it wasn't meant for us. I mean, let's face it, he had a particular audience that he was speaking to.
If it's true, if it's good, all sorts of things, that's fantastic. But I think people kind of focus so much there. Maybe some people accused more conservative-minded Catholics back during John Paul II and Pope Benedict of being ultramontanists, where my bishop's not doing what he should be, but Pope John Paul II is. I'm going to talk about him. Now I feel like it's almost flipped sometimes.
It has flipped.
And it's just not healthy. It's just not a healthy way of living, because no person's words when they're speaking constantly can be used as universally defining. But however, we still believe that the Pope is that teaching authority of the Roman Pontiff is protected by the Holy Spirit. Right. And so if there's something unclear, it always has to be viewed against the teaching authority of the Church, what the Church teaches on interreligious dialogue, what the Church teaches about salvation. Dominus Jesus was a great document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, now the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, under Cardinal Ratzinger, that very, very clearly reiterated that Jesus Christ, you are only saved through Jesus Christ, and anything good from other religions and everything else is ultimately good as a preparatory, as a propedeutic towards ultimate faith in Jesus. So anyway, the Church has clear teachings on this.
And I wish that's where Pope Francis would have went. With it, of course, we can sit here and say how much we wish he would do this, that, or the other, just like anyone can about the Pope, that they wish he would speak.
I wish he had stopped right then and prayed for Florida State, our football team. I'd be like, guys, I know this interreligious dialogue is important, but we just pray for the Knowles right now. The Knowles are an American football team.
Yeah, you can see them all going, what is he talking about?
I think something would have happened then. But anyway, that didn't happen. Didn't happen how I wanted it to happen.
So surprise, surprise, what does the Catholic Church teach? What do we believe as Catholics about these pathways to God?
There's one pathway to salvation, which is through Jesus.
Yes. There's only one name under heaven by which
there's only one manner in which you can be saved is through
Jesus.
Jesus might appear in various different ways to us, and likewise speaks to us in the many languages of man.
Right.
And I think that's hopefully, I'm guessing that's what Francis was also kind of alluding to in whether it's a good analogy or not. But God speaks in all the different languages that man speaks, and that God can work outside of the boxes that we sometimes place him into. So, but there's only one pathway to salvation, and there's only one gate,
which is Jesus,
which is our Lord.
And so recognizing that and I mentioned Dominus Jesus, which is a great document, which means Jesus is Lord. That's what the document means. Is that very clear statement? It's fascinating too. When that document came out, it was viewed with great there was some difficulty in Christian communities, Catholic communities that were in kind of pagan areas, and there was a lot of rejoicing in this of Catholics that were in kind of historically Catholic areas, because it kind of gave that clarity that they needed.
Right.
But it was difficult in areas because it was basically saying, like, actually, no matter what you believe, Jesus is really is the unique and sole mediator between God and man. So he says, so in that, it basically like talks about how we can't have an understanding that the revelation of God, Jesus Christ, is limited, and that's made up for by the other religions. That's
there's not a lacking.
There's not a lacking here. That's like, oh, without the Sikhs and their understanding of God, like, and then it all forms this whole puzzle. It's like that God has revealed Himself to us, and this is the difference. It's not just us seeking. Oh, I feel the tusk. Oh, I feel the foot of the elephant. It is God has revealed Himself to us, starting with the Old Covenant, starting with the Old Testament. That God has revealed Himself to His people, made covenants with them, formed a relationship with them, given them the commandments. Sent His prophets, all those things that the Spirit has been animating that, and that ultimately, and this, the fullness of time, God sent His Son. So God, the Son, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, has actually entered into our human condition through Judaism. So in a sense, it's that continuation, fulfillment of the Jewish faith, and revealed Himself to us. And this is the way I am to be worshipped. This is how you have eternal life, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood.
Right.
And He says that literally. That's not a symbol. Be baptized and be saved, as Saint Peter says, in the house of Cornelius. Turn from your sin, believe in Jesus Christ. All these sorts of things. So in a sense, we're beholden to that. Now, other people have not yet heard the message. Some people heard parts of it and were turned off of it because of the way we proclaimed it. Some people have grown up in other cultures and societies. We're duty bound to share the good news of the gospel with them, not as the destruction necessarily of everything they believed before, but of the raising up of all the good things. There are things that need to be set aside. There are, what you think about when the missionaries came to what is now Mexico. There was human sacrifice going on, and the missionaries and the conquistadors, you could say all you want about them, but they had to put an end to that. Right. They had to cease that, because this is a demonic, evil activity. Mm-hmm. And it was encouraged and part of their faith. And so it can't just be like, well, whatever they believed is fine, and it's all equal ways to God. Yeah. It's like, no, this is something. Now, are there aspects of their faith, aspects of their religion, culture that still need to be celebrated? Absolutely. And needs to be lifted up and redeemed and baptized and ultimately led to Jesus, absolutely. Which Our Lady Guadalupe, which we have, she's you can probably see part, and in the corner over here, she's that perfect enculturation of that, like as that great. She's the great evangelist. Mary's that great evangelist, her model of evangelism. When she came in 1531, she was half native, she was half Spanish. She's a mix of those two. She brings all those things together in her. I think that's the church at her best is the church that is enculturated properly, but it's ordered towards the unique lordship of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for this conversation, and thank you for joining us as well. I think the three of us would encourage you and say, please pray for the Holy Father. Please continue to support him in the ways that we're asked to do and we're able to do. And we'll see you next time on Catholic in America.